I'm going to talk about what I think is one of the key background conditions, and that's rising income inequality. So here's the key background condition that I want to focus on that sets the stage. The Pope's with me that rising income inequality is a key background condition, but the Pope put it, if you could catch it before it disappeared, the Pope put it in very general terms, and I want to put it in more precise terms. What's the effects of rising income inequality on workforce mobility? And I'll talk about two types of workforce mobility: absolute mobility and relative mobility. So let's start with absolute mobility. Here, what we care about is whether or not children are making more than their parents. And that's a pretty salient consideration when you go back home. Your parents' standard of living is there in your face, and the question is whether or not you're doing better than your parents. So I'm going to first examine trends in absolute mobility using de-identified tax records, the decennial census, and current population survey data. I'm not going to go into this in any great detail as to how we constructed these trends, but I just want to get to the bottom line results. So again, what we're asking is whether or not children are making more than their parents, okay? And we're comparing children at age 30 and their household income at age 30 as against the household income of parents, when the parents were also roughly age 30, okay? And of course, correcting for inflation, so we're using the same metric. So just, are children doing better than their parents? That's a fundamental part of the American dream, right? And what you would see, if you could see the graph, would be on the x-axis, would be just the parental income percentile, ranging from 1 to 100. Maybe we'll get there. Children can be born into any one of those percentiles. And on the y-axis, we have the proportion of children born into each of those percentiles that made more money than their parents, right? So that's the measure of the American dream. Did you do better than your parents? And what we see is that if you're born into the 20th percentile, which is roughly the threshold for poverty, if you're born into the 20th percentile, 93% of the kids made more than their parents in the 1940 birth cohort, right? And so this is when those kids were 30 years old. So in 1970, 93% were making more than their parents. If you're born into the 95th percentile, near the top of the income distribution, you still had an 84% chance of doing better than your parents. So this is the American dream realized across all percentiles. 92% of all children were doing better than their parents. Almost everyone's upwardly mobile. So now let's fast forward to the 1980 birth cohort. So these now would be kids who at age 30 were getting their incomes in 2010. That bottom yellow line shows what's happened to this absolute mobility measure for the most recent 1980 cohort. Let's look again at the 20th percentile, a kid born into the 20th percentile. Now only 57% of those kids, are making more than their parents, down from 93%. So you don't get a consolation prize anymore if you're born into poverty. In the past, if you were born into poverty, at least you'd do better than your parents. You'd exit poverty with very high chances. Now it's just a little bit better than a coin flip, that you'll actually make more than your parents even when you're born into poverty. And what if you're born into the 95th percentile? Now you only have a 27% chance of doing better than your parents, down from 84%. And if you average across all percentiles in the 1980 birth cohort, just about 50% do better than their parents. Okay, so that's where we are in terms of absolute mobility. You might ask, how can we get back to the past? How can we get back to the very high rates of absolute mobility that prevailed in the past? And there's two hypotheses that you might have. One is that we just need more growth, because one very fundamental feature of the past, of the 1940 birth cohort, is that it was a moment in historical time in which there was lots of economic growth. And you might think if we can just ramp up growth again, we'll be good. The other possibility is that we need to change the amount of inequality, the way in which that growth is distributed across the income distribution. So let's take a look at both of those possibilities. Let's first explore the growth hypothesis. So here's a representation of such growth as prevailed in the 1940 birth cohort. The blue curve pertains to the income distribution among parents in that 1940 birth cohort. And then the red one is their children when they're age 30. Okay, and you see this huge rightward shift in the distribution. That's growth, massive growth between parents and children in that 1940 birth cohort. So much growth that let's consider the case of a child born into the 80th percentile. So a child born into a very well-off parental household. Let's say that kid doesn't do very well as against her or his peers in that 1940 birth cohort. That kid who starts off in the 80th percentile drops down to the 14th percentile relative to the other children in that birth cohort. Still beats the parents. Even though you drop from the 80th to the 14th percentile, you still beat your parents. Why? So much growth. So you can even fall in relative terms and do well in absolute terms in 1940. Okay? But let's say we took that kind of growth and imagined that it was in play today in the 1980 birth cohort. Lots of growth. What happens to absolute mobility? Well, here we have a chart that shows just what happens to absolute mobility. The bottom curve pertains to the 1980 absolute mobility rate. We already saw that. And the top one in blue pertains to the 1940 birth rate. Sorry, 1940 rates of absolute mobility. We saw that change. It's a dramatic decline, right? We want to try to get back to those 1940 rates. So what if, as I just said, what if we give the growth that prevailed in 1940 to the present day 1980 birth cohort? Would that do the job of getting us back to the rates, the high rates of absolute mobility that we had in the past? The answer is not really. It would only get us up to an average amount of absolute mobility of 61.9%. That's that yellow curve. Let's now do a different thought experiment. Let's say that we take the rather low economic growth that prevailed in 1980, keep that as it is, don't go back to the higher 1940 rate, but keep it as it is, but now distribute that growth more broadly. Distribute it across the income distribution more broadly, in the way that it was broadly distributed in 1940. So reducing inequality now. Not ramping up growth, but reducing inequality. If we do that, we find that absolute mobility almost gets back to the rate that prevailed in 1940. So here's the instinct as to why that's playing out as I just showed you. If your job were to get as much absolute mobility as you could, and you could allocate growth in any way that you wanted, how would you allocate that growth? Would you give it all to, say, the 1%? If you did, which is roughly how we do it now, if you did, the folks in the 1% would have a good chance of beating their parents, but no one else would, right? So it's not an efficient allocation of growth if you're putting it all up at the top, insofar as you care about absolute mobility. If instead you distribute that growth broadly, then lots of folks are going to experience absolute mobility. That's the intuition behind the main result here that you can get back to the very high rates of absolute mobility that prevailed in the past by distributing growth broadly. So that's absolute mobility. Now let's turn to the question of what are the implications of rising inequality for relative mobility. Again, we're talking about the big background conditions that we're running up against as we try to affect workforce mobility. So with relative mobility, we shift to the question of how children born into well-off households fare as against children born into poorer households. So the comparison now is with two types of children, children born into advantaged circumstances and children born into less advantaged circumstances. How much is there a payoff to having the stork drop you into an advantaged circumstance? That's the question that we ask now. And the workhorse measure in answering that question is the intergenerational earnings elasticity. It's simply the expected percent change in a child's earnings given a 1% increase in her or his parents' income. So this is how you can think about it. Let's say you were just born, the stork is flying you to your new home, And the store can drop you in one of two households. The first household, the parents make, say, X dollars, and in the second household, they make X plus 1%. The intergenerational earnings elasticity tells you how much extra money as a child you can expect to earn when you're an adult by virtue of being dropped into that household that has 1% more of household income. If the elasticity is 1, it means that you can expect a full 1% more yourself as a child by virtue of being dropped into that household in which the parents make 1% more. If it were 0 instead, which would be the American dream, it would mean it wouldn't matter where the stork drops you. Your expected earnings would be the same in either of those two households. This is a fundamental measure of the extent to which there's relative mobility. The question is, how does rising income inequality affect that measure? And here I think you have to introduce one further wrinkle, and it's the wrinkle of commodification. It's not just that inequality alone matters. What also matters is rising commodification. So let me just tell you what I mean by that. There are two ways you can get goods, services, and opportunities. It can be a birthright. You can automatically get them by virtue of being born into a society. You can automatically, say, get health care as a right, a human right, by virtue of being born into society. Or you can allocate health care, say, in a different way, or any other good, service, or opportunity. You can allocate it by virtue of those who have the capacity to pay for it. So every society has a fundamental decision to make about how goods, services, and opportunities are going to be allocated, universally to everyone as a birthright, or you pay for it. Commodification of opportunity means that increasingly we're making that second decision as to how to allocate opportunity to kids. We're allocating opportunity to kids on the basis of whether or not the parents can buy it for them. And when you allocate opportunity in that way, it means that income inequality is very consequential for who gets opportunity. If you have to buy it, then it matters whether or not you have the money to buy it, right? So let's just think through what it's like now to be a poor parent. A poor parent who wants their child to do well in the US. What kind of obstacles does that poor parent face? Well, first off, we know it matters deeply to get into a good neighborhood where there's not going to be a lot of stress, a lot of crime, where you're going to have good networks. My colleague Raj Chetty has shown very, very compellingly how important it matters to be born into a good neighborhood. So of course, as a poor parent, you want to raise your kid in a good neighborhood, right? Well, here's the problem. Increasingly, it takes money on the table to get into that good neighborhood, right? That's what rising economic segregation means. The poor are increasingly living with the poor. The rich are living with the rich. It takes money to get into those neighborhoods that will deliver good outcomes. You got to put the money on the table in the form of renting that high-end apartment or buying that high-end house in order to have access to the kinds of neighborhoods that yield good outcomes. Here's another problem. Increasingly, you got to put money on the table to get high-quality childcare. In the past, childcare was delivered in the house. It was an in-kind operation. It wasn't on the market. Now it's on the market. Not a problem for people who have the money. Big problem for people who don't. And again, we know that high-quality childcare matters deeply in terms of securing opportunities for one's children. Here's a third problem. And these are just a random selection of the kinds of problems that illustrate this commodification of opportunity, putting opportunity on the market. Here's the third problem. You want a second income stream to raise your child well, right? Having more money in the household will help. Well, who has access to big earning streams as a partner? Well, it's people who already have high earning streams. Increasingly, the rich are marrying the rich, the poor are marrying the poor, and that means you need money to get money. You need money in order to get a second earning stream that's high. So those who don't have that money, those who are poor, are disadvantaged, and increasingly so. So the implication is opportunity is increasingly on the market. It's for sale. We're allocating it to those folks who have the money to buy it for their kids. And that's the textbook condition under which inequality matters. If you are selling opportunity, if you're putting it on the market, then of course it matters who has the money to buy it, right? So in the US, where we put opportunity on the market, you'd expect that intergenerational earnings elasticity to be very high and growing. And so I'm going to give you some data, again relying on de-identified tax data. from the earliest period in which you can use such data. 1987 is a magical day or year for people who care about intergenerational earnings elasticities. It's the year in which the IRS required that you supply the Social Security number of children if you're going to claim your children as a dependent. That matters because it then becomes possible to identify those children when they themselves become adults and have earnings of their own. And so you can use these tax data in order to estimate the earnings elasticity in the US. Here's the earnings elasticity graphically represented. The x-axis is parental disposable income. The y-axis is the expected earnings of the children. You see that it matters a lot to be born into a household in which there's lots of disposable income. Your expected earnings will be much higher as a result of that. How do we compare against other countries? We're a renegade country. We have an elasticity that's much higher than that of most other countries in the world, and it's partly because we combine high inequality with high commodification. That is, we say we're going to put opportunity on the market, we're going to sell it, and then we have extraordinarily high inequality that means that those at the top have the money, more so than in other countries, to buy that opportunity. So here's the summary. There are two reasons why a key background condition in trying to increase workforce mobility, a key background condition is the extent to which we are running a high inequality society. Firstly, it's going to affect absolute mobility, the point with which I led off. If you allocate growth principally to those at the top, it's going to be very hard for those at the bottom to do better than their parents. It makes it difficult. If instead you allocate growth in a broader-based way, that's an allocation that's fine-tuned for the purposes of delivering absolute mobility to many, many people, not just to the 1%, not just to those at the top, but to everyone. The worst-case situation, just to put it in extreme terms, would be if all the growth were allocated to the single person at the top. That person would beat their parents, but very few other people would. So that's the first problem. Rising inequality means it's very difficult to deliver high rates of absolute mobility. The second problem is it's also difficult to deliver high levels of relative mobility, especially when high inequality is combined with high commodification. If we say that you have to buy opportunity, then it's going to matter who has the money to do it. So we've set the conditions under which inequality matters when we run a society in which opportunity is put on the market. So in that sense, the Pope was right to worry about rising inequality. So I just want to conclude by asking what might be done. And there are two possible responses. Insofar as you care about delivering on the American dream and providing a society in which there's lots of mobility, there's two ways we could go, if we care about that. The first way is to say, look, commodification is a done deal. That's what the US is about. We want to put everything on the market, even opportunity. It's all for sale, and there's nothing we can do about it. So we acquiesce to commodification. We can still make this work, but then we have to deliver enough money at the bottom of the income distribution so the parents can buy opportunity for their kids. It's on the market, right? Got to deliver them the money so that they can at least buy opportunity for their kids. Because that's supposed to be the one thing that doesn't depend all that much on the luck of being born into a well-off family. So we give enough money, maybe through a basic income or in some other redistributive mechanism. We deliver enough money at the bottom so that they can deliver some opportunity to their children, even when it's on the market. That's option one. We could make rising commodification work if we at least deliver enough money to the bottom so that they can buy opportunity for their kids. Here's another way to go, though. Let's say you think that kind of aggressive redistribution is not very likely in the US. So we've got to do it another way. Well, the other way is to decommodify, is to take those goods and services that are very, very important for delivering opportunity for kids, like say high quality childcare, and take them out of the market and deliver them to everyone automatically, regardless of whether or not they have the money to buy it. So that's the other way to go. And of course, we've done some work on that front. You can think of healthcare as something that's been taken to some extent out of the market and delivered to everyone. So decommodification, reversing the tide of commodification, isn't impossible. It's happened, and we could expand that commitment to other sorts of opportunity delivering services that are currently in the market but could be taken out. My view would be that we got to go either way if we want to deliver on the American dream and create high rates of workforce mobility. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.